Right guys, you'll be glad to hear this is the last video linked to theme 1. It's the last thing that you need to know on the specification, but it's very important that you understand this. What we're looking at in this video is government failure. What we know is that markets can fail, so where we don't consider those external benefits and external costs, where public goods are not provided, and when we have information failures. Well, government intervention tries to correct these different problems in markets. But quite often, when the government intervenes in markets, we can have government failure. This is where intervention fails to correct the market failure. Sometimes you could actually argue that it makes it worse. Okay, so I'm going to go through each intervention strategy and give you some of the different government failures that could exist. Now, a sales tax, first of all. The theory behind a sales tax is it will lower demand for things like a negative externality, a demerit good. The trouble is, it's very difficult to work out how much the tax should be. Okay, governments lack full information. They don't always fully appreciate how big the external costs are or the external benefits are, and that could lead to them setting the wrong tax on a particular good or a service. The tax could be too high or it might not be high enough. Linked to that, the other problem is, how do you put a value on those external costs or benefits? We call this shadow pricing, trying to work out the value of something. There's a lot of external costs which people need to be compensated for are very difficult to put values on. So aeroplanes, for example, create noise. Well, what is the value of that noise for individuals? You know, how much should they be compensated? £20, £30? So if you can't shadow price, it's very difficult to correct a market failure. Linked to that one as well, you've got the problem of what will they spend the money on? The assumption would be that the tax money raised will be used to compensate people for those external costs that have been created. But there's no guarantee the government will do that. Okay, they might just use it as simply a political tool to try and create more income for the government. You've also got linked to this one as well, price inelastic demand. Poor policies. So for example, if you were to impose a high tax on smokers, if demand was price inelastic, it would have a very minimal impact on demand. So what you could argue is the government are not putting that tax in place to correct a market failure. They're doing it simply to raise money. Now, if that money's been spent on correcting or paying people for those external costs created in that market, that's fine. But there's no guarantee the government will be doing that. Okay, now you've also got another problem linked to this, which what I would call political agenda. Now, all political agenda is, it's where the government chooses not to do something because they think it will be unpopular. So, for example, imposing a tax on, let's say, petrol is unpopular. Now, we have a big tax on petrol, but many economists believe it should be higher if we fully take into account those external costs. But the government know that sometimes that's very difficult to do. It will be an unpopular choice for lots and lots of different people. The next one was a tradable pollution permit. Now, the problem with this is its enforcement. If you're going to set limits on firms in terms of how much pollution they can create, you've got to, in effect, employ big teams of people to go around the country checking businesses to make sure they're complying with these different pollution permits. Well, that's going to cost a lot of money. And the problem that's going to mean is you could argue the cost of actually enforcing the permits costs more than what benefits it actually creates for the economy. You've also got to ask the question, well, what is the optimal output? What is the right amount of pollution? So again, governments will have information failures. They don't fully understand the environmental impacts of pollution. So again, you know, how can you work out what an optimal output is? You've also got the problem here, though, as well, is that quite often when we have pollution permits, they're too cheap. They supply too many of them. Okay, so when demand is there, because there's a huge supply, it will make the permits really cheap, which means the price that the businesses pay for the permits that low, they don't bother trying to cut their pollution in the first place anyway. You've also got the problem across the world of free riders. Okay, if one economy was to put pollution permits in place, charge its firms more, If other economies across the world say, well, we're not going to bother, they can free ride in the back of our clean air, and then we kind of say, well, what's the point in us doing it? And the whole thing could technically collapse. Okay, now what I would say for both, well, if I was to go back and add one more thing actually, so I apologise for this, but for sales taxes, one problem here we might have as well is it might encourage a black market. If you put taxes too high, you get an underground market which is illegal, where people try and sell things at cheaper price to avoid having to pay that tax. So again, you've got cost of enforcing that tax as well for the government. Subsidies. Well, I would say one of the biggest problems with subsidies is the cost. That blue box you can see on the board here, well, that is the cost for the government. Huge subsidy. Well, you've got to question where will that money come from? We've got a government which is crippled by debt. Paying for that subsidy will cost them an absolute fortune. That coming, there's less funds available to provide other things in the economy, like public goods or things that create positive externalities in other markets. Very difficult to do. Another problem is that this can also crowd out the private sector. If certain firms are given big subsidies by firms, it gives them an advantage over other businesses. And that could lead to, new businesses not starting up, not competing. And it could mean the firms that get the subsidy kind of become a little bit complacent, a little bit lazy. And this is what we call moral hazard. Okay, if businesses think they've been backed up by the government, then they almost feel like they can't fail. They've got no incentive to become more efficient, make things cheaper, become better at doing stuff, because they're relying on that handout from the government. Another problem with subsidies, and you could argue it applies to most types of intervention, is the bureaucracy. This is looking at, all the different jobs that have to be done to enforce these subsidies, or, to make sure they're spent properly. Firms that receive subsidies have to fill in excessive amounts of paperwork to employ people to make sure these subsidies have been spent in the right way. Governments will then employ lots of people to check the subsidies have been spent in the right way. So you could argue a big chunk of the actual subsidy of our tax money is actually being used to actually make sure the subsidy has been spent in the right way. Now, for the next one, state production, I would argue you've got exactly the same problems with the subsidy. Think about the NHS. If the NHS provides all healthcare in Britain, it will crowd out private sector investment. Okay, it will stop private firms from entering that market and maybe even doing a better job than what the NHS does. Okay, you've also got the cost to the government of providing things like healthcare is excessive. Moral hazard, the NHS have got no technical need to become more efficient. They're not really competing with anyone else for business. And again, you've got the bureaucracy involved in this. Right, now moving on to maximum and minimum prices. Go for maximum price first of all, the one on the right hand side of the board. The big problem with a maximum price is that what it will do, it will create excess demand. Okay, so if we should be there, but we end up here, ignore that S2 for now, we will get this excess demand in the market. Now, the market would normally solve that problem by raising prices back up to P1 to clear the market, but the market can't do its job. So we end up with big excess demand where we have waiting lists. So across Britain now we have waiting lists for all sorts of different services. This could be swim pool for children. It could be council houses for people trying to find somewhere decent to live. So it stops the market from doing its job properly. Minimum prices. Problem with these is the exact opposite. It will create excess supply. So supply will be bigger than demand. So more firms want to supply than what there is demand. Again, the market would solve this problem by bringing the price down to P1, but it can't. Okay, so what you tend to find is that lots of underground people, a black market, if you like, will try to sell things at lower prices than the minimum price, which means it's all illegal. It's like a black market economy that's encouraged again. Moving on. Regulation. I would say some of the problems with these ones are what we call the law of unanticipated consequences. Okay. Quite often when you bring rules in to try and stop something, it will lead to other problems that you didn't anticipate in the first place. So examples could be if we try and enforce people to throw away rubbish in bins. it could ultimately mean that eventually what will happen is we have more fly tipping. Some people argue that attempts to try and reduce smoking across the country has actually led to more people actually buying cigarettes illegally on the black market. Okay, to avoid taxes, for example, and that kind of regulation that's been imposed on people. And you've also got as well the problem with this is the enforcement costs. So by making things like drugs illegal, our police forces spend a fortune every year enforcing these laws. So many people would say, well, actually, if it was legal, we could tax it and raise tax money from it instead. But at the moment, it's a big cost for the taxpayer to enforce all these different laws and regulations. The last one was linked to providing information. Well, think about the problem with this. It's what I would call, what is the cost again? Getting that information across to people is very, very difficult. And we're also assuming that the government have the correct information to pass on to people in the first place. It's not always guaranteed. And then linked to that one as well, you've got what I would call people failure. There's no guarantee that passing that information on to people will lead to people taking it on board. So the government could spend all that money passing the information on, and it makes not a blind bit of difference in the market. So guys, good news. That is the end of theme 1. Good luck with your revision, and let's see what you can do in those mock exams.